Hello and welcome to the Thursday, June 12, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, and this episode brought to you by the SANS.edu undergraduate certificate program in applied cybersecurity is recorded in Jacksonville, Florida. Well, in diaries today, we have Xavier looking at yet another image. This time, it actually leads to the install of a Quasar remote admin tool. Now, it all starts pretty innocuous with a little bat file. That file will download the actual installer injector. It'll also load a normal Word document, and that's typically done because the user just clicked on something that looked like a Word document. So after starting the malicious code, the malware loads an actual Word document, so the user really thinks nothing bad happened. Well, the second stage then will download this kind of noisy looking image. This is actually an encrypted code that will then be injected into the running process here by the batch file that was downloaded. Also interesting that the second stage being downloaded relies on environment variables defined by the first stage. That way, if someone would just reverse analyze the second stage without having access to the first stage, then of course that wouldn't execute, wouldn't actually do anything bad. For example, like if you would just quickly load that script into a sandbox or such by itself, well, it wouldn't really show up as malicious. VirusTotal doesn't do a good job here, or I should say the antivirus tools being sort of represented by VirusTotal do a pretty lousy job in recognizing any of this as malicious, which probably is also due to this not sort of being a very widely spread threat, but something that's a little bit more boutique, which is, well, why Xavier was interested in this particular sample. Then we got a couple follow-on items here to Patch Tuesday this week. First of all, if you're running Windows 11, the 24H2 update was rolled out gradually as Microsoft posted. Apparently, they had some issues with certain hardware configurations initially that have now been resolved, and everybody should now be able to download Windows 11 24H2. And one of the highlights, of course, of this week's Patch Tuesday was a patch for an already exploited vulnerability in the SMB client. Well, we have now more details about, including a proof of concept exploit. I liked the Synacktiv write-up about this particular vulnerability. It goes in depth into the actual root cause of the vulnerability. Microsoft described as a privilege escalation vulnerability. And that's really sort of the nature of the vulnerability in allowing basically users access as a system. However, it's really, as Synacktiv also described in his blog, more sort of a code execution vulnerability then, because you can then actually execute arbitrary commands on the system as system. And Connectwise published an advisory noting that it rotated its signing certificate for its software, in particular Screen Connect. If you remember, we had a couple of weeks ago an incident at Connectwise that affected some Screen Connect customers. Since then, they published now a couple of details about this particular compromise, but really not a lot what the actual sort of nature of the breach was. So there's some concern that maybe there was more than initially stated. However, this update appears to be also related to a software update going to be released shortly, if it hasn't already been released, that will further tighten up the Screen Connect configuration. Apparently, what has been happening is that scammers did send users legitimate copies of Screen Connect with their own configuration and basically tricking the victim to connecting to the attacker's server. And that way, by sort of including these configurations in the signed content, they hopefully will make it more obvious if an attacker is sending their own configuration instead of one provided by Connectwise. Well, then we got an interesting vulnerability in KDE, actually, really in the console, the terminal that comes with a KDE. The reason I cover this is not because I think desktop Linux is sort of such a big deal, but I think it's an interesting issue that people often forget there is more than HTTP and HTTPS URLs. Well, there is a number of different protocols. They often then start commands. For example, telnet : / will typically start telnet. However, in this particular case, if you don't have telnet installed on the system, which a lot of modern Linux systems don't have installed anymore, then the argument, which is the URL, is just directly passed to bash, leading to a very simple command execution. Exploitability is a little bit tricky because typically on the console, you would see the URL in the clear, so it's a little bit more difficult to hide here in this particular context, but certainly something that you definitely should patch. And yeah, be aware that it's not just HTTP and HTTPS. And that's it for today. So thanks for listening, and thanks for liking and subscribing and whatever you do to promote this podcast. And talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.